arguably being one of the most famous men in all of history and a household name all around the world, with hardly any hard evidence surrounding much of his life, but over 2,000 years later, his life is just as fascinating to us, with many TV shows and films being made, with Karl Marx even writing, "the most splendid fellow in all of ancient history." His real name and age not even known with much certainty, or his life before fighting as a gladiator. Much of our perceived knowledge of Spartacus comes from the 1960 Kirk Douglas performance with Spartacus being crucified at the end, which is a Hollywood tale. The Spartacus slave revolt is arguably one of the biggest events in Roman history and greatly overlooked, even young Julius Caesar helping to quash the rebellion in the 1st century CE. At his peak, the former slave would command over 90,000 men, being 20 more thousand than the current British Army. Much of what little information we have on Spartacus comes from the Roman historians writing decades after his death. The earliest we hear of him is in Plutarch's writing on the life of Crassus, the richest man in Rome and one of the history's richest men, being the senator who brought an army and defeated Spartacus. Plutarch's Life of Crassus is written in the early 1st century AD, over 170 years after the death of Spartacus, without the possibility of any living witnesses, being agreed on by modern scholars that Spartacus was most likely around the age of 32 at his death, put the year of his birth in 103 BC. Spartacus was a Thracian, today's Bulgaria and northern Macedonia. Nothing at all is certain of his life before fighting as a gladiator. Many accounts suggest that he was a former soldier or mercenary. Florus writes, who from a Thracian mercenary had become a Roman soldier that deserted and became enslaved, and afterwards, from consideration of his strength, a gladiator. Most accounts agree on his possible desertion from Roman forces, but is most likely improbable, with Romans always hanging deserters. Going on to be a heavyweight gladiator called a Murillo, fighting with a large shield, sword and helmet, sold to the gladiator trainer Leonatus Batiatus, and being taken to Capua, a large city of the time 105 miles or 169 kilometers south of Rome. Spartacus spent considerable time as a gladiator, most likely winning a great many games in the arena. In 73 BC, Spartacus, along with 70 other slaves, escaped Batiatus' gladiator school, using stolen kitchen knives, killing him in the process, once free, stealing weapons and training armour. Though only Spartacus' name lives on in history, 2 other men became commanders of the army that they would help to create, with Crassus the Gaul, who would later part in a disagreement with Spartacus, taking a large chunk of his army but being defeated by the Romans and killed in battle. Another man called Onimaeus, a slave possibly from Gaul or perhaps modern-day Turkey, but dying in an early battle, possibly in late 73 BC. Spartacus and the 70 other slaves that escaped would be joined daily by runaway slaves, but not all of Spartacus' army were slave. Some were free men from the lower parts of Roman society. At his peak, Spartacus had 120,000 followers, with somewhere under 90,000 fighting troops. After the break from Capua, they quickly crushed Roman forces sent to put down the rebellion. With guerrilla fighting at first, then leading to full-on pitched battles, and by 71 BC controlling the bottom third of Italy. Plutarch says later that year Spartacus planned to pay pirates to ferry 2,000 of his men to Sicily to create a slave uprising and get the reinforcements, but the pirates double-crossed him, bribed by the Romans. It's not clear as to what Spartacus' motives were. It's unlikely that Spartacus wished to reform Roman society or abolish slavery. Plutarch writes that Spartacus wished to cross the Alps into Gaul and return to their natural homes, but this is challenged by the fact that they had the opportunity to do so when in 72 BC they defeated a large and well-equipped legion commanded by Lucius Publicola, but chose to remain in Italy rather than cross the Alps. Appian and Florus write that the rebels intended to march on Rome itself and plunder the great city. Florus and Appian both write that over 170 years later, so it's possible that they had no evidence and this was untrue, but it seems clear that Spartacus' army had no intention of leaving Italy. Though the army was capable of great cruelty, when Crassus had parted from Spartacus and took a large portion of his army, but was then defeated and killed in battle, Spartacus arranged funeral games in his honour, and made captured Romans fight to death as gladiators. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, paid, equipped and led his new troops, but he did not get off to the good start, with Spartacus's rapid movements and having the upper hand and a motivation of his own army, even resorting to bringing back the old Roman practice of decimation, where every 10th man was clubbed to death by his fellow soldiers. In 71 BC, Spartacus's forces had retreated to the Bruttium Peninsula in central southern Italy. With Crassus's new army, they dug a large ditch 37 miles in length and a small palisade, an amazing feat at the time and accomplished in just a few months. During this time, the army under the control of Pompey in Spain was recalled back to Rome to aid Crassus, but Crassus, not wanting the glory stole, chose to engage Spartacus. The Battle of Salarius River would be Spartacus's last fight. On the banks of the Selle River, with rebels charging the Roman legions stood in their traditional formations, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Sometime into the battle, Spartacus led a small contingent of troops and tried to reach Crassus, killing 2 centurions but failing to reach Crassus. Accounts conflict as to his last moments, with Appian giving more details, claiming that Spartacus took a pilum or javelin through the upper thigh and dropping to his knees, then being overpowered and killed. Appian also writes how Spartacus's army desperately fought on but greatly struggled and ended with the rebels fleeing onto the surrounding mountains. Crassus's army desperately searched the battlefield for the body of Spartacus, but was furious when he couldn't find him. Some accounts have the body of Spartacus carried away from the battlefield, but with no real way of ever knowing. Spartacus was never crucified like in the 1960s film with Kirk Douglas, but Crassus did crucify 6,000 of Spartacus's army, with their bodies leading back to Rome along the side of a road. But to Crassus's spite, Pompey would end up taking most of the credit for the defeat of Spartacus and the end of the Third Civil War. Still to this day, endless companies, army groups, sports teams bear the name of Spartacus, with Hollywood hit films and a successful TV show adaptation of his life, over 2,100 years after his birth, with still to this day hardly any hard facts to who Spartacus really was, more than a Bulgarian slave turned general. All of our knowledge of who Spartacus really was is only a couple pages from Florus and Appian, with Crassus, the man who defeated him, being little more than a footnote in history, compared to probably one of the most famous men who ever lived.